I can't remember whether we've actually sung that hymn since I've been here or not. But by the time we got to the second or third verse, y'all were just singing just great. and hopefully sometimes when the tunes are not familiar, we pay attention to the words a little more. So hopefully, at least even if you were a little confounded by the tune, the words of covenant were speaking to you. You got a little foreshadowing of Noah, whose covenant we'll do in a couple of weeks, and Abraham, who we'll be talking about today. Now, just a little Sunday school reminder. You may have remembered from Sunday school that Abraham's name starts off as just being Abram. The ha is left out initially, and it isn't until later in the story that God changes Abram's name to Abraham. Abram means exalted father, and Abraham means father of many nations. So there's a real interesting twist in the midst of that. So as I mentioned kind of up front, it seemed an appropriate time, being the new year, to talk about covenants. It's an interesting concept if you're a Bible nerd, I guess, anyway, of seeing how the biblical covenants mirror in some ways other Near Eastern covenants and treaties and things that are around Israel's neighbors. You know, Israel kind of lived in their world, and so there was certain vocabulary that they used from the nations around them, so there were always certain things that were similar, but then they always had their little twist on it. So yeah, you could borrow the language of a Hittite treaty, but when you're talking about God, it's going to look a little different. And so it's interesting to do sort of comparing and contrasting. There's a little bit of difference between treaties and contracts and biblical covenants. One of the things that scholars tend to, when they're looking at biblical covenants, try to figure out is the difference between covenants that are unconditional and covenants that are conditional. So they tend to look at the Abraham covenant and the David covenant as being, these are unconditional. God just makes a promise. You know, for Abraham, I promise you this land, go. For David, I promise you a kingship that will last forever in a dynasty. And even though David screws up, the promise still remains. And then there are covenants that scholars look at and say, no, these are definitely more conditional, like the Mosaic covenant, Moses covenant. You know, there's a whole batch of laws, right? You got to do this in order for God to hold up God's end of the bargain. And I still, as I was just kind of generally studying covenants, I kind of struggled with some of those categories because I don't think it fits that neatly. I think on the one hand, to some extent, everything that God does has a flavor of being unconditional, of grace. God doesn't say, you have to do this in order for me to love you. I will always love you. There's always this very unconditional part, this grace part that underlies every biblical covenant. Now, in Abraham's case, that's go, I will be your God. There are other things along the way, and if you respond to this promise really well, there will be blessings for you along the way that will happen as a result. Kind of like being a parent, right? A good parent anyway. You always love your kids no matter what, but you tell them, and if you do what you're told, there will be some blessings along the way, right? The underlying love and grace is always there. It is unconditional no matter what, but it's another level of conditions. There are things, though, that if you do A, B, C, and D, these things will go well for you. So there's always a level of unconditionalness to whatever God is doing. And there are also these other conditional blessings sorts of things that God tells us, you know, it will really go much better with you, though, if you do what I tell you. So what is God doing in this covenant with Abraham? I'm going to go ahead and say Abraham instead of Abram, just so we don't get confused. And why? One of the things that is happening here, that as you study the Abrahamic covenant, they say there's an election of one righteous man out of a world of sinners. Okay. Well, this assumes that Abraham is particularly righteous. We don't actually know that from the text. Was there anything in the text that said, and Abraham was this really great dude? Whatever the Hebrew equivalent of really great dude would be. For Noah, whose covenant we'll look at in a couple of weeks, the text is very explicit. The text in Genesis 6 says, Noah was a righteous man who walked with God. Oh, okay, that's why Noah gets picked, because everybody else has gone to heck in a handbasket, and Noah's okay, so God's electing this one righteous man out of everybody else. Doesn't necessarily say that in the text about Abraham. In the Quran, because Abraham is, we share in common with Judaism, ourselves, and Christianity and Islam. There's a lot of Abraham stuff in the Quran, and the Quran does talk about Abraham as being explicitly very righteous and virtuous. And maybe he is, maybe he isn't. I don't really know. When you read some of the next verses in Genesis, and there are some shenanigans going on with Sarah in Egypt, it makes you wonder. Maybe Abraham's not so perfect after all. So what do we know about Abraham? We know where he's from. That's the first thing we find out. He's from Ur in the Chaldees, about as far east as anyone in the Bible has yet been. Well, why is that important, Larry? There's this very interesting thing that happens through the first 11 chapters of Genesis. And that is, as things go to heck, right? Genesis 1 starts off, God speaks a perfect world into being, right? God looks at it, and it was good. And then it's all kind of downhill from there for the next 10 chapters. And as everything goes downhill, people move further and further east. So when Adam and Eve are expelled from the garden, they're expelled to the east of Eden, right? When Cain murders Abel, Cain is exiled to the east. By the time you get to chapter 11, the people who are building the Tower of Babel have migrated to the east, to the plains of Shinar, where Babylon is, to build the tower to try to pierce heaven, and it's kind of the ultimate example of hubris and human pride. So everything has been moving further and further east. As somebody who grew up on the west side, I resonate with this directional, because it seemed like the further east you went, the fewer trees you had and the more concrete. I really liked it, but that's my own prejudice. So Abraham starts off in the east, and he is called upon to reverse the trend. God says, go forth to this land that I will show you. Go west, old man. He's called upon to change Israel's direction from sin toward God. So it's kind of ironic that at the first, Abraham starts the furthest away from God in the direction of sin, and yet he's chosen for that very reason, chosen to be the answer for those first 11 chapters of Genesis, to change the direction of humanity. I like this notion of direction. Can't remember which of the small groups it was. We came up with a visual. We drew little concentric circles on the whiteboard. And we said we often think about the important thing being how close we are to God. And so that the ideal would be to be in the middle of the circle, and that the further out you got, the worse it was. And yet, as you look at the ministry of Jesus very rarely, never worries about location on the circle. He's worried about what direction are you going. So there may be these people that are way out here on the circle, the prostitutes, the Samaritans, the prodigal son, whoever else. But if the people on the margins are walking toward the middle, Jesus is rejoicing. they're going in the right direction. Woohoo! There may be people who are right in the middle of stuff, the insiders, the Pharisees, and whatever, but if they're standing still or moving further and further away from God, even though they've started closer, Jesus is like, oh, come on, guys. It doesn't matter where you're located. It matters which direction you're going. So in this new year, as you yourself are perhaps taking stock or making resolutions, don't lament where you are in your own relationship to God. Don't compare yourself thinking, oh, so-and-so is so much closer to God than I am. Why am I so far away? Or certainly don't do the opposite of looking at somebody who you think is kind of far away and go, well, at least I'm not them. Don't worry about comparing one way or the other. Instead, think about which direction am I going, and simply resolve to move toward God wherever you are. Take steps. Like Abraham, go forth, which in Hebrew is lechi lach. We'll keep coming back to that every so often. Possibly changing your own direction, certainly positively affecting change in the direction of the world around you. So not so much the election of one righteous man from among sinners, but the direction of one man in answer to sin. The second thing that may well be happening here is that this is the first stage in the election of a people. We talked about the first stage in the direction of God's people. Now we're positing the first stage in the election of God's people. And this certainly seems to be the case. You remember the whole string of patriarchs, right? You start with Abraham, and then we have the same promises given to Isaac, and then Jacob, whose name is changed to Israel, and he becomes the father of the 12 tribes, right? And the Joseph story. But is it the election of a people? Maybe the better way to think of it is the formation of a people. The first stage in God starting to form a people who are going to be moving in God's direction. Abraham is instructed to leave 3 things: his country, his kindred, and his father's household, and to lechi lach, go forth to become a new nation, a new tribe, and a blessing to all the families of the earth. There's sort of this parallelism, right? The 3 things he leaves and the 3 things he's going are new versions. So the first is he leaves his country toward a new nation, one that's defined not by culture, but by covenant. We're very fortunate in this country. There's a strain of our American DNA that is very similar to this, right? That in e pluribus unum is the notion that the unum doesn't destroy the pluribus. We're not supposed to be a country that's based on blood and soil and common culture, but whatever our cultures are, we come together in a common covenant. For us, as imperfect as it is, it's our Constitution. And that's what unites us as a people, rather than these particular things. And when we're at our best, I think that's who we aspire to be. So move from country and culture to new nation, defined by covenant, where many peoples can be together. Move from kindred to a new tribe, based on blessing, not blood, based on faithfulness, not familial ties. You might remember Jesus was teaching in the synagogue one day, and Mary and his siblings show up, and they try to get him out of the crowd. In the Gospel of Mark, it says that Mary and his siblings are actually worried that he's going a little off his rocker. And Jesus says, no, I'm busy teaching. He turns to the crowd and says, who are my mother and brothers and sisters? But those who do the will of God. Family is not just blood. Family is bigger than that. based on faithfulness. Again, common covenant. So Abraham's called to move from country to new nation, kindred to new tribe, father's household, to becoming a blessing to every household. And it's inherent in that name change, right, that I told you about up front. He goes from being Abram, exalted father, to Abraham or Abraham, father of many nations. It mirrors the Great Commission, too, right, that Jesus gives at the end of Matthew's Gospel. Go. He didn't say lechi lach because he was talking in Aramaic instead of Hebrew, but he could have said it. Go, therefore, and make disciples of all nations. It's the direction of the gospel in Acts, right? Does that concentric circle thing again, right? Starts in Jerusalem, moves to Judea and Samaria, and then whoosh, out to the ends of the earth. Go from one household to becoming a blessing to every household. So with Abraham, and like the spread of the gospel for which Jesus calls, we need to draw our circles ever wider from our country, kindred, and households, from our own communities, tribes, and parties, respecting the capacity of people that we perceive, rightly or wrongly, to be further out on the margins, to have the capacity, to have the moral agency to walk in the right direction toward God. And having enough humility to realize we may well learn far more from those people on the margins who are struggling through their barriers to journey toward God than we ever could from those who are already at the center, maybe sitting on their laurels. Jesus was always pointing towards the folks on the margins as lessons for us, right? It was always about the repentant prodigal, or the prostitutes, or the Samaritans, the people who were left out. But if they were struggling to do their best to walk inward, he said, that's where to look. Not the priests and the scribes who think they've got all their stuff together. One of the last things that appears to be happening in this covenant is the rewarding of land for Abraham's righteousness. Now, I like Paul's take on this myself in his letter to the church at Galatia. Just as Abraham believed God, had faith in God, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness, so you see, those who believe, who likewise have faith, they are the descendants of Abraham. And the scripture, foreseeing that God would justify the Gentiles by faith, declared the gospel beforehand to Abraham, saying, all the Gentiles shall be blessed in you. For this reason, those who believe are blessed with Abraham, who believed. See, while there's a case to be made for the land being a reward for Abraham's obedience, I think there's an even stronger case to be made that righteousness, right relationship, is itself the reward for Abraham's faith, for his trust in God, for his going forth to a place that God has yet to show him, to a land he doesn't know, on a journey that has no brochure, to be a blessing to generations yet unseen, yet unfathomed. Yes, God's provision is part of the promise, even an important part, but God's presence is the primary blessing. Remember, the rewards of faith are not material well-being or prosperity, land, wealth, health, but the reward of faith is right relationship, righteousness, divine and human companionship for the journey. And coming out of the Christmas season, celebrating the birth of the one whose name is Emmanuel, we know that's what it's all about, right? That God is with us. There's a song that we almost always sing at temple at High Holy Days that goes with this Abraham passage. It's based on the Hebrew line I've said to you a few times now, lehi lach, which just means go forth. And it's a lovely song and a good sentiment. Lechi lach, to a land that I will show you, Lech lecha, to a place you do not know. Lechi lach, on your journey, I will bless you, and you will be a blessing. So lechi lach, go forth. We'll listen to some folks sing it right now.
You shall be a blessing. You shall be a blessing. You shall be a blessing.